Hey everybody, it's low carb and keto nutritionist Amy Berger back for my third appearance here with the Adapt Live and Adapt Your Life audience. Before we get down to business, I want to tell you about an event Adapt Your Life is having September 22nd in Roxborough, North Carolina. I'll be speaking. Adapt Your Life co-founder Dr. Eric Westman will be there. Casey Durango from Go Keto with Casey will be there. Keto cookbook author Christy Sullivan will be speaking, and also Dr. Wickham Simons. So come see us in Roxborough on the 22nd of September. Those Adapt events are really great because they come to your town. You don't have to buy a plane ticket. You don't have to take 3 days off from work to attend some big keto event all the way across the country. So take advantage of that. Come meet some low carb and keto like-minded people in your town. You can see you're not the only one doing it. Plenty of people are doing this. So we will see you on the 22nd in Roxborough. All right, down to business now. I am the author of The Alzheimer's Antidote, which is about using a low-carb or ketogenic diet as a nutritional intervention for Alzheimer's disease, cognitive impairment, and cognitive decline. Today, I'm going to talk to you about something else that is one of my favorite topics in recent months. One of the things I enjoy most about writing my blog is that I get to share with my audience the really interesting and fascinating things I learn along the way. And this thing that we're going to talk about today is not only of professional interest to me, but of great personal interest as well. I came into low carb from having been heavier. I was heavy despite doing a lot of exercise, despite doing what I thought were all the right things, lots of whole grains and all that. And, in today's modern society, body size, being overweight or obese is kind of like the last acceptable target, right? It's no longer politically correct to comment on or make fun of people for their religion or their race or their gender. And yet when it comes to the size of somebody's body, we still have this kind of knee-jerk judgment. Like we assume that by knowing absolutely nothing about somebody except the size of their body, we can make assumptions about what they eat, how much they eat, whether they exercise, how much they exercise. And having gone through a history of, like I said, following what I thought was a healthy diet, doing lots and lots of exercise, running 2 marathons, and still not losing weight, this is a very personal issue to me, this sort of knee-jerk judgment of people on their size. So with that in mind, what I want to talk about today is something called the personal fat threshold theory. Maybe it's a hypothesis. I'm going to call it a theory. I didn't popularize this. I wish I could take credit for it because it's brilliant and it's fascinating and it's so elegantly explains so many sort of seemingly paradoxical things in health and metabolic health. But I didn't create it. It was Roy Taylor and Rory Holman wrote a paper about it. There's a researcher out of, I think, the UK named Keith Frayne that has written papers about it. So we'll get to the details in a minute, but any theory that explains obesity, metabolic syndrome, type 2 diabetes, and any of the other conditions associated with insulin resistance or chronic hyperinsulinemia has to account for at least 4 things. I have notes here. This is too important a topic to me. I didn't want to screw it up. So if I look down at my notes, you'll know why. First, it has to account for why type 2 diabetes, cardiovascular disease, gout, hypertension, all these other metabolic problems, why these occur in people of all body weights, not just in people who are overweight or obese, but in people who are at a quote unquote normal body weight, which that phrase is problematic in itself. What is a normal body weight? Number 2, it has to account for why people that have bariatric surgery or people who adopt a low-carb or ketogenic diet often have very, very quick reversals or improvements in blood glucose, in insulin levels, in their diabetes control, in hypertension, very, very rapidly after having the surgery or after adopting the keto or LCHF diet, long before they've lost any significant amount of weight, right? If obesity was driving all of those conditions, then those conditions would not get any better until those people lost 40, 50, 100 pounds. But they do, right? Those issues improve very rapidly, very dramatically. Number 3, this theory has to account for something called metabolically healthy obese and TOFI, thin outside fat inside. They also call that the normal weight obese. That means you have somebody who's at a lower body weight, or again, a normal body weight, but who has a lot of metabolic problems, maybe possibly even including type 2 diabetes, cardiovascular disease. And yet on the other side, you have someone who's very, very heavy, but they're metabolically healthy. When you look at their blood work, you're like, wow, this person's in perfect health. Has to account for that. Number 4, any theory that's explaining all this has to account for why low-fat diets actually do work in some people. I know that's like verboten, that's like the third rail of a keto video to say that some people actually do have success on low-fat diets, but they do, and we can't deny that. What we should do is explain why. And this personal fat threshold theory does all of this beautifully. So in a nutshell, the personal fat threshold theory says that each of us has a genetically determined ability or capacity to store fat in our subcutaneous adipose tissue. Subcutaneous is just a fancy word that means under the skin. And this is where the fat is sort of supposed to be stored. It's metabolically safer, if you will, for your body to store fat there. The subcutaneous adipose is the fat, in our upper arms and maybe even in our chins and in our hips and thighs and our backsides. But that's where fat is supposed to be stored, if you will. That's metabolically healthy, metabolically safe for your body to store fat there. However, once each of us reaches our own individually determined personal fat threshold, once the subcutaneous adipose compartment is full, any excess incoming energy, whether it's coming from carbs, whether it's coming from fat, whether it's coming from anything, has to go someplace else because there's no longer any room in the subcutaneous adipose. It has to go someplace else. It can't just magically evaporate, right? I wish it would. We all wish excess energy would evaporate. I mean, if it did, I'd be out of a job and we'd all be at our ideal body weights and life would be grand. But once the subcutaneous adipose compartment is full, one of the places excess energy will be stored is in the muscles. And there's supposed to be a certain amount of adipose interspersed with our muscle cells, but we're not just talking about that. And we see that in marbling, right? If you get a good quality piece of beef or lamb, you see the white fat streaks throughout the muscle, and it's flavor, it's delicious, right? That's the fat being stored in the muscles. But we're now starting to have marbled people, right? People with fat stored all throughout their muscle. But it's not just fat interspersed with the muscle the way it's supposed to be or the way it's okay. We actually have lipid droplets inside the muscle cells. It's called intramyocellular lipid accumulation. That's dangerous. That's what we don't want to have. And once the muscle is full of fat, or maybe it happens concurrently, to be honest, I'm not sure, another place the excess incoming energy will be stored once your personal subcutaneous capacity is at its max is in and around your internal organs. Those internal organs are called your viscera, which is why we call that visceral fat. And now there's a little pad of adipose there. If you look at an anatomy textbook, there is a small pad of fat stored right under the skin of the belly. But we're not talking about that. We're talking about when fat is stored in and around the organs, specifically the liver and pancreas. And the liver and pancreas are your two most important organs of blood sugar regulation. When you have fat building up in and around the organs most responsible for your blood sugar regulation, you are going to have major problems with blood sugar and insulin levels. Your body does not want to put fat there. I guarantee you, fat is not supposed to be in your pancreas and in your liver. If it's there, there's a problem. Now, let's consult the notes. This is actually when insulin kind of rises, right? If your body is insulin sensitive and if your subcutaneous adipose tissue has plenty of room, you don't need a whole lot of insulin in order to get energy to be stored because it's okay to store it there. Fat's coming in, carbs are coming in, no problem. When that capacity is reached though, when that capacity is full, your body has to work harder to deposit the energy in places it's not supposed to be deposited. That's when the insulin starts to rise because now The insulin has to force your body to store fat. You will store this fat in the pancreas. You will store it in the liver. And I'm going to make insulin so high that you have to store it there even though you don't want to. You have to store it there because there's no place else for it to go. So I feel like even the high insulin level is already a late player in the development of metabolic derangement because it's only going to rise once your personal fat threshold is reached and you've got to put the energy somewhere else. So I actually, more and more, I am disliking the phrase insulin resistance because are your cells resistant to the actions of insulin or are they just full? If your cells are absolutely at their maximum capacity to store fat, it doesn't matter how much insulin is secreted. If you can't store fat, you can't store it. So the cells aren't resistant, they're just full. Think of a crowded bus in a major city at rush hour, right? When the bus is leaving downtown to go back to the suburbs, it's full of passengers. But maybe it fills up with passengers before it reaches all the stops on the way out of town. So when it reaches a stop and there's people waiting to get on the bus doesn't stop, the bus just keeps going. There's nothing wrong with the bus. The bus isn't broken, the bus driver isn't breaking any rules, the bus is just full. It doesn't matter that there's more passengers waiting to board. The bus cannot accommodate them, so the bus goes by. And I feel like that's what's happening with some of these insulin-resistant cells. Are they resistant or are they just full? They can't listen to the action of insulin because there's nothing for them to do about it. Now, they have done some studies where when the cell is full, it's so full of fat that it's engorged and the cell is actually distended, that the insulin receptors, the glucose transporters literally cannot be transported to the cell. But again, that's not being resistant to the actions of insulin. That's that they're so overfilled with fat that they're not working properly to respond to insulin. So I actually kind of dislike the phrase insulin resistance these days. Let's talk about one of the beautiful things. One of the beautiful things about the personal fat threshold is that it explains why, like I said, one of the things it has to explain is why we see all of these metabolic problems in people at any body weight, obese people, slightly overweight people, and people at what we would consider a normal or healthy weight. We see this in China and India right now. China and India have absolutely exploding rates of type 2 diabetes, metabolic syndrome, and other related disorders. But they have a much lower body weight. For whatever reason, they are like genetically, constitutionally unable to store 300, 400, 500 pounds of excess adipose subcutaneously. They are never going to be morbidly obese like we are in North America or Europe, or if you're watching this in South Africa, where Adapt Your Life is from. The Chinese and the Indians simply don't have the genetic capacity to store that much fat. But because they can't store that much fat, at least in their subcutaneous department, they store more of it in their liver and pancreas at a lower total body weight. So we see all of the same metabolic complications in them, even though they're not overweight or obese. And we see this even in Caucasian people, even in European, North Americans. Plenty of us know people that are thin, that have raging type 2 diabetes, raging cardiovascular disease, hypertension, gout, all of these other metabolic conditions, even though they're not obese. And on the other side, what else do we see? This is where we talk about TOFI, the thin outside, fat inside, or the metabolically healthy obese. There's something called the obesity paradox, but when looked at through the personal fat threshold capacity, it's not a paradox at all. It's actually totally logical. TOFI is thin outside, fat inside, where you have somebody who is not overweight or obese. They're at a normal body weight, but maybe they have a lot, because they're at a normal body weight, maybe they have a low personal fat threshold. So instead of becoming 300 or 400 or 500 pounds, they build a lot more of that fat into their liver and pancreas, just like the Chinese and Indian people. So they're going to develop all of these metabolic problems, even though they are not overweight or obese. And on the other side of that, we have the metabolically healthy obese, which is where you would see maybe a 300 or 400 pound individual who, when you get their blood work done, like, wow, their blood sugar is normal, their insulin is normal, triglycerides are low, all this stuff looks good. And that may be because because they have such a very high personal fat threshold, they have a great large capacity to store subcutaneous adipose. Their body has no need to deposit any of that adipose in the liver and pancreas because it can keep on storing it in their face and in their arms and their legs and their hips, again, where it's sort of metabolically safer to store this fat. So they do not develop all of the metabolic complications even though they're overweight or obese. So it's the obesity paradox basically says that these people that are very heavy seem to be somewhat protected from these metabolic complications. They have a lower risk for type 2 diabetes, lower risk for cardiovascular disease, but it's not a paradox, right? If all of that fat is stored away from the viscera, if it's stored in the peripheral adipose, you're not going to have those metabolic problems. Some of the low-carb doctors that I know have even said the phrase, obesity is the price you pay for not becoming diabetic. It's almost like the obesity protects you from the metabolic complications because that fat is not stored in your blood sugar regulating and your sort of insulin sensitivity determining organs. What else do we have? Okay, any theory that attempts to explain for all of this has to also explain a medical condition called lipodystrophy. Lipodystrophy is I think it's genetic. I'm not sure if it's a genetic mutation but it's a sort of congenital, like you're born with this issue, where you have an inability to store subcutaneous adipose. You have very, very limited storage for body fat. But because patients with lipodystrophy have very limited ability to store the fat, again, in those metabolically safer places, more of the fat earlier at a younger age at a lower body weight goes into the pancreas, into the liver, in and around the visceral organs. And those lipodystrophy patients develop type 2 diabetes, cardiovascular disease, metabolic syndrome, all of these other things at a much, much lower body weight. And they've done some really fascinating experiments in, I don't remember if it was rats or mice, but some type of rodent model, where they inject mice or rats with lipodystrophy. They inject these rats with subcutaneous adipose cells. So all of a sudden, this excess energy coming in has somewhere to go. It doesn't have to be stored in the liver and pancreas anymore. It can go into the subcutaneous where it's supposed to go. And these rodents have dramatic reversals of all their metabolic problems. And I don't know if that's something they've ever done in humans or if it's even something you can do in humans, but it's fascinating that they've at least demonstrated in rats, in a model of lipodystrophy, that when you give that fat, that visceral fat, somewhere else to go, and it goes there, you basically reverse all the metabolic problems. This is part of why the BMI, the body mass index concept, is so terribly flawed. It works on a population level. When you can see that over the course of 50 or 60 years, a population of a country or a continent has had huge exploding rates of obesity, then the BMI concept works. We know people are getting heavier. But on an individual level, from person to person, it's extremely flawed because the BMI accounts for only two things: your height and your body weight, your scale weight, the force of Earth's gravity upon your physical body. That's what weight is. It doesn't account for where the fat is stored, if it's stored subcutaneously or in your visceral organs, and it doesn't account for muscle mass. So this is why we have people, professional athletes, who based solely on their BMI are considered obese because it doesn't account for the muscle. These men and women are so heavy, but they're heavy with muscle. And it doesn't account for people with a low BMI, a healthy BMI, who have very low muscle mass. They may have actually a very high body fat percentage and very low muscle mass and be at greater risk for some of these metabolic complications, even though they're not heavy. Their body composition is what we want to look at more. So this personal fat threshold really explains all of this. It explains why we can have lower weight people that are extremely metabolically sick. We can have very, very heavy people who are metabolically relatively healthy. And it also explains why the fourth thing we had to explain is why low-fat diets do work for some people. Now, most of us watching this definitely favor the low-carb, Atkins, Banting, LCHF approach, but there are people that do respond well to a low-fat diet. And I think the reason this can work, low fat and low carb can both work, but you have to do it properly. When you're eating very low fat, when you're eating mostly carbs, eating carbs, burning carbs, eating carbs, burning carbs, even if your insulin is kind of high, if you're in the carb cycle, it's actually fine. As long as you're eating very, very low fat, even if your insulin is high, there's not a lot of incoming food energy to be stored, right? You can't store fat if there isn't a whole lot of fat coming in. And I know people who are partial to the low carb diet, myself included, want to believe that most of our stored body fat is coming from excess carbs that were being converted into fat from de novo lipogenesis. But the truth is, most stored fat comes from dietary fat. So when you're not eating a whole lot of fat, when you're on a very, very low fat diet that's high in carbs, you probably still will not accumulate a ton of body weight because there's not a lot of fat to be accumulated. And on the other side, when you follow a very low carb diet, you're eating a lot of fat, but you're burning the fat. You're eating the fat, burning the fat, eating the fat, burning the fat, because you're not eating carbs. What you can't do is high carb, high fat. That's the kiss of death, right? That's the standard modern Western diet that got us all heavy and sick. So Dr. Ted Naiman, one of our favorite low carb doctors, says carbs displace fat oxidation. And what that means is, when you eat carbs, you have to burn carbs, period. Carbs are always burned first in preference to fat. And it's not binary, it's not one or the other. We're always running on a lot of different fuels concurrently: fat, carbs, ketones, alcohol, whatever your diet is. But the more carbs you eat, the less fat you burn, so you have to store the fat. Eat carbs, store fat, eat carbs, store fat. But if you're not eating fat, if you're only eating carbs and you're burning the carbs, then it does make sense why some people do respond to a lower fat, higher carb diet. I don't think that describes most people in the modern Western world these days, but certainly we can't deny the fact that some people do have success on that diet. Maybe they even find it easier to stick to than low carb, but it works for some people. So I'm running out of time. These videos are supposed to be kind of short. But I just love the personal fat threshold concept because it just explains so elegantly so many of these things that, at least on the surface, don't make sense. Again, the normal weight obesity, the metabolically healthy obese, the TOFIs. It explains why people have very rapid, very dramatic improvements in diabetes and metabolic syndrome after bariatric surgery or adopting a low carb diet. It's kind of like, because the fat being stored in the visceral organs is so harmful and so damaging for the body, it's like first in, first out. Because the body doesn't want the fat to be there, it's the first place the body's going to take it out of. And I think that's why the type 2 diabetes, the hypertension, all of that gets better. The insulin sensitivity improves, even when these people are still technically obese. They could still have 200 or 300 pounds to lose before they're at, again, a normal body weight, and yet their diabetes is reversed. The hypertension is gone. The PCOS is gone. The gout is gone. The cardiovascular disease is improving, even when these people are still obese, because the fat stored in the damaging compartment is gone. And I've heard different things on that, though. I've heard some people say that that's the last place, which is why some people, even though they're losing weight, their blood sugar is still high, the insulin is still high, they may still struggle over the long term. I honestly don't know what the answer is. Maybe it differs from individual to individual, but it seems to be that is where the fat would be removed from first, because that's where the body wants to get rid of it from first. We don't like the way subcutaneous adipose looks. In the modern sort of aesthetic, we all want to be svelte, we want to be thin, we want to look a certain way. And so the subcutaneous adipose works against us in that sense. It makes us look heavier than we want to look, fat or squishier than we want to look. But for your body's internal health, it's better to have that fat than it is to have the fat in the internal organs. So I think that's where the body gets rid of it from first. And we see this in the lipodystrophic mice. I guess that's it. I don't want to go on because I'm going to repeat myself, but this is just so fascinating, and it explains, if like me, you are someone who struggled with your weight for a lot of your life, feeling jealous of friends that were thinner, that never exercised, that ate garbage, it's not your fault. It's not my fault. It's not your fault. there's nothing you can do to change your personal fat threshold except be aware of the concept and be aware that you have to eat, manage your carbs, manage your fat even, in a way that keeps your subcutaneous adipose either at its max or under its max. Because once you're over, that's when the metabolic problems start. So respect your personal fat threshold, understand that we're all going to have a different capacity for that, and I guess that's it. We'll see you in Roxborough on September 22nd. Again, my blog is tuitnutrition.com, TUIT nutrition.com. And thanks, Adapt Your Life, for having me again. Take care. Bye.